Has Samsung regained top spot with the S20 Ultra and Galaxy Z Flip?
And was it the right decision to allow the TPG Vodafone merger? Vertical Hold is proudly sponsored by Casa Systems, taking Australian technology to the global market.
Welcome to Vertical Hold, behind the tech news, where we talk to Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the news of the week. I'm Alex Kidman, and I'm joined as always by Adam Turner, a man who's given up hopes of building his own mobile network, to talk through the week's biggest technology stories. So, this week, Samsung unveiled its worst-kept secrets in the Galaxy S20 range and Galaxy Z Flip phones, and we'll cross shortly to San Francisco to chat with Jen Dudley Nicholson from News about her hands-on experiences with Samsung's new flagship phones. Meanwhile, closer to home, after months of speculation, the federal court decided to allow the TPG Vodafone merger, and we'll be talking to Supratim Adhikari from The Australian about that as well. But first, Apple finds itself in the unusual position of being slapped, and specifically slapped by the French, Adam. What's the story
extra
there?
For that?
So I've heard.
Well, I mean, this story's been around for a long time in different forms. There's always been a feeling from the very beginning that Apple would do things to slow down old iPhones when a new iPhone was put out. This goes right back to, I had the iPhone 2G that I imported from the US. And as soon as the iPhone 3G came out and they put out an iOS update for the iPhone 2G, it was never the same again. It just never coped. And I saw with the next few iPhones after that, what they would do is a new iPhone would come out. The update would basically cripple the old iPhone for a while, and then it would slowly come good again, by which time you've probably thought, screw it, I'll just buy a new phone. Now, that's not the conspiracy theory, although I'm pretty sure it's fact, that we're talking about today. We're talking about a different conspiracy theory that we actually know is fact. And this is that Apple was deliberately, but not telling anyone, slowing down old iPhones when their battery capacity was dropping a bit to try and protect the performance. So their argument was, well, you're not getting as much out of it, but the phone is more stable and reliable.
The battery lasts longer because we've slowed it down. We're burning less fuel.
Yeah, but not just that, the phone's now a bit more reliable and a bit less likely to crap out because suddenly it's tried to draw too much power from the battery and has crashed. So, I mean, they're all noble pursuits, but you really should tell people before you're doing this thing, is what the French are saying.
Yeah, look, I mean, I sort of have a bit of sympathy with Apple's position in this specific case, because I think the reality with a lithium-ion battery is it does degrade over time. If you use a phone every day, they start to wear out, and having software in there that says, hey, look, we'll make this a bit more of a smoother ride at the cost of performance, that's not a bad thing. It's like your laptop. If you've got a Windows laptop, you've got that whole thing when you unplug it, it goes into a lower power mode to last longer. It's pretty much exactly that. It's just Apple was really, really bad at communicating it.
And did they get fined here, or did ACCC make a big deal about it as well? Did Sims try and smash that one?
I don't think they got Sims smashed on that score. They have been Sims smashed in a couple of different other ways. Although Le Sims smash, as it were, was not in one sense. So they got fined €25 million. And look, I'm not in a pay grade where €25 million is, not a lot of money to me, but to Apple, it's pocket change.
Yeah, it's not going to change the way they do things. Apple's have always had that attitude of, we know what's best. Don't ask about what happens behind the curtain. Don't worry your pretty little head about that. Just you use the phone and it'll all be good. And I don't think that a €25 million fine is going to change that.
Arguably, actually, coming out of Europe, more importantly for Apple, was the recent EU decision around mobile charges, which basically said, we've got to have a mobile standard, because Apple was arguing, you can't do that because people will have to get new connectors and it'll lead to lots of e-waste, which was kind of an interesting tack to take. Well, I thought it was a really interesting tack to take because they were completely silent on that score when they jumped from the old 30-pin dock connector to the lightning cable. It was just like, nah, we're doing this. You'll like it. So usually on Vertical Hold, when we use the phrase sim smash, we're talking about the ACCC smashing someone for doing something wrong. But this week, Sims was the one who got smashed because the ACCC's long-standing contention that TPG and Vodafone should not be allowed to merge was overturned by the federal court. And we're joined by Supratim Adhikari from The Australian to discuss the implications of this. This is a big story in the telco space, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and it's been highly anticipated verdict here as well. So, I mean, the whole industry was sort of waiting to see what would be said. But the result itself is not that much of a surprise, because I think a lot of us who covered the case in last September had a feeling that the federal court was quite sympathetic to TPG and Vodafone's claim, and it was looking tough for the ACCC even back then.
Do you think they overstepped the mark there?
Oh, it's just about overstepping. I mean, in the end of the day, you do want a regulator that is quite rigorous in its assessment, and you don't want a regulator that just basically rubber stamps every merger. I think what's interesting in this case was the ACCC really built its case on a hypothetical, right, which was that TPG will build a fourth mobile network in this market, irrespective of changes in the market, with regards to, whether it's the Huawei equipment ban or, the fact that the market itself, the market composition was starting to change, or, the capital intensive nature of building mobile networks, right? At the end of the day, that's what TPG and Vodafone ended up telling the court. They said, well, especially in case of TPG, their founder, David Teo, made it crystal clear that TPG didn't have the money to build a fourth network. So and I think today's decision shows that the court certainly bought that, hook, line, and sinker. They absolutely took David Teo for his word.
I've seen a lot of speculation actually around this, that David Teo was playing a poker game with all of this, because TPG definitely started to roll out a mobile network. Do you think they ever particularly intended to, or was this all just market positioning?
It's really hard to kind of to make a judgment call on that. I know I'm aware of some of those calls as well in the market, that maybe it was all an elaborate plan to begin with, a big bluff to begin with. I think the reason why that persistent idea is there in the market is because the original outlay from TPG for the mobile network was relatively small, $600 million. It's very difficult to make to roll out a viable mobile network or at that sort of, with that kind of spending. But, on the flip side of that, TPG had invested enormous sums of money buying spectrum, right? And there was always, I guess, that counterpoint to it. Well, why would you buy so much spectrum if you can't really use it? So it's hard to tell whether, TPG was doing was bluffing with regards to building its own mobile network. But I think we have to take into account that, the removal of Huawei from the 5G market in Australia did certainly have ramifications, and did certainly would have had an impact on TPG's overall planning.
Yeah. So the ACCC would argue that this is not a win for consumers, but you could look at it either way. Do you think we would have been better off with a fourth network?
Look, my personal view is I think, the way the market is right now, there is a very strong chance that we might have ended up with, we might have had four networks, but essentially two vertically integrated businesses and two really subpar networks, from a mobile perspective, right? So TPG would have had a bit of mobile and its fixed business, which, is already under a lot of margin pressure right now and will remain so at least for the next 2 years. Vodafone would have had to, at some point, had a reckoning of sorts as well, because, the last 12 months or so have not been very good for that business. They weren't really gaining much more market share. I think their network quality was starting to go down as well. So I think there was a strong chance if this merger had been rejected, we would have ended up with four players in the market. But, TPG and Vodafone, to what extent they would have been, highly competitive, I think that's really doubtful. So right now, as things stand, and like I said, after a few, there's still a few regulatory hurdles left. But, pending those clearances, we are now essentially going to see a third very strong operator emerge in the market.
So if TPG had built a network, do you think we would have been back to the bad old days of 3 and Orange, where we had this very metro-centric network that was fine as long as you didn't get too far away from the city, but then you were doing all these ugly roaming deals and handovers and stuff to try and make it work?
Look, that's kind of my assessment to it because, TPG would have really, I think they would have gone to the market and raised more money, right, to build out the network more. But I think their network would have been really focused on optimizing where their fiber network is, right, and where their fiber infrastructure is. And that's primarily in the metro and built-up areas, right? So what you would have seen is, I think, a fairly, specialized sort of a network and really focused on high-value metro customers, leaving regionals, probably underserved.
I think the original spec called for something like 80% coverage of population, which would certainly fit with that. The new head of what will be eventually TPG did a media call earlier today where he was very much mirroring that line you were just saying there of them being a big competitor to Telstra and Optus, and that being better for consumers than having, I think the phrasing he used was hundreds of NBN providers, for example. Do you think that actually has merit? Is there better? Is there a better outcome for consumers having that stronger combined new TPG rather than lots of other players? And where does that leave your little NBN players and your little MVNOs?
Well, I think the one thing that I feel, that would have been a better outcome here was, and this is obviously, in hindsight now, but, rather than go through this whole legal tussle and all of that, there could have been an option where the ACCC could have given it a conditional approval, right, where it could have set certain conditions that the telcos would have had to meet for the merger to go ahead. And I think the one crucial one in that would have been for the merged TPG Vodafone entity to absolutely open its network to MVNO providers, to provide them, competitive wholesale deals. Because right now that MVNO market, from my understanding, is still very much geared towards Optus being the major wholesaler in that market.
Absolutely. They've got Kogan, TPG, oddly enough, have jumped over to Vodafone, and they did that a little while ago. They've got Kogan as probably their biggest other player, but that's it.
It is something that Vodafone is capable of doing, right? And I suspect now what happens is now it becomes purely a market-based decision on whether, the TPG will look to the MVNO market or not. There's nothing mandated, so it's totally up to them. But ideally, what you would expect or what you can hope for is, the combined TPG entity would now have substantial spectrum, right? Substantial capacity on its network. And you would hope that they now try to inject a bit more competition by partnering with more disruptive MVNOs. Because, for whatever, the ACCC put out, as their argument for blocking this merger and whatever the merits of that, I think it's very hard to argue with at least one contention, which is that, look, this really does firmly close the door on any more disruptive, operators entering the market. Because, TPG was it. They were the most disruptive in the fixed line market. They were looking to be disruptive in the mobile market. But now we are essentially consigned to 3 players, and it's going to be very hard to displace their dominance in the market. Time will tell just how competitive TPG will be. I personally don't think they will be very competitive on pricing because, just like Telstra and Optus, they need a ton of money to make 5G happen. So I can't see them, coming back to the market or with any incredibly disruptive pricing.
I can't see them being terribly effective on MVNOs, though, because the new entity is itself, 12 brands or something like that? It's not just TPG and Vodafone, it's also IONET and Internode and Westnet and all those other sub-brands. And, they're different value propositions. I could totally see them saying, actually what we'll do is we'll sell, Vodafone premium phone services and then TPG can keep its, we're a bit of a budget player offering in the space and they still hoover up all the money.
So look, I guess, obviously that bit you mentioned about, the fact that TPG does operate a number of brands in the fixed market. It'll be interesting to see how. I mean, that is the other big question, right? I mean, how does this integration play out between these two companies? I mean, both run fairly lean operations compared to a Telstra and Optus, but I mean, both have very different cultures, on how they run their businesses, especially how they interact with consumers as well, with their customers. So I think that will be, I guess, in some ways, a near-term challenge as well, as how do they manage all these internal branding and how does this sort of mobile, fixed sort of crossover work out now? Because clearly they'll try to, obviously, some of that customer base will now be sort of targeted in a way, right? Because if you're an internet customer, you may not be a Vodafone customer. But now, I guess there will be new offerings coming your way in some way, right, to get you to perhaps become a Vodafone customer. So it'll be interesting how that plays out as well.
If TPG had built its own metro-centric network, was there any idea whether they were going to target that as a fixed line replacement? And do you reckon that now that they're going to build one together, they might try and go down that path similar to Optus of, trying to steal people away who might have been NBN customers?
Look, I think the fixed line NBN bypass thing is never going to go away. I mean, clearly, I think
fixed wireless. I meant to say, not fixed line. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think, like I said, that force is not going to go away until there is until NBN Co relents on the pricing. There's no doubt about that. Look, how they target it remains to be seen, right? Because I mean, Inaki Barada today, was saying, so that they're going to try to get their skates on getting that 5G, offerings to the market by the end of, calendar 2020, which is pretty amazing given how much time they've lost. But, just how effective fixed wireless is going to be, I don't think they're going to jump into it straight away, because, I mean, you look at Optus, how successful has their fixed wireless NBN bypass option been so far? I think it's still very early days for that product, right?
They made a bit of noise about it, but we haven't heard much about it lately. I don't think.
I mean, did they say anything about it today? Because I think they had some numbers out today as well. I think they're saying good traction, but they've taken a very softly approach to that. So I don't think I think the immediate focus for the new TPG would be to just actually, obviously, the integration of the two businesses. Rationalizing of the brands. I mean, there's going to be a lot of changes within the management team as well, right? Because there was never really anything said to the market, around what the executive makeup will be, other than the fact that, the two top positions, that was it. So I think that's going to happen. That needs to happen, and that'll be a big focus for them. Just I think for the moment, it'll be just about leveraging that extra spectrum to, I think, fundamentally improve the mobile services for Vodafone customers. I think that'll be the first thing we'll see, because I think Vodafone's mobile performance has actually, kind of gone backwards over the last year or so. So I reckon that would be, I think to me, that's the most immediate uplift that we can expect to see from this merger.
Yeah. Are the ACCC likely to appeal, do you think?
Well, I mean, Rothens was saying today that, ACCC will need to consider the full judgment in its entirety. Obviously, what we got today from the court was a summary of sorts, really, because there's some commercially in confidence information that's there, which won't be released to the public. Look, I think it'll be, given how comprehensive the victory is for TPG and ACCC and Vodafone this morning, I think it's going to be pretty hard for ACCC to come back with a counter argument. I mean, their core argument has been summarily dismissed by the court today. I think the court looked at David Teo's testimony and has put a lot of credence to it. Has really, I think in some ways, I think it's fair to say that David Teo's decision to, finally show his face in public and go to court and sit through that, as difficult as it might have been for him, I think it's really paid off for him.
I guess it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next couple of months. Thank you very much, Supratim, for joining us on the show.
So, Supratim, if people want to find you online and on social media, where can they do that?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Supratim A, and that's probably the best place to find my work for the moment.
Time once again to roll out the increasingly unreliable vertical hold virtual satellite as we cross to San Francisco, where Jennifer Dudley Nicholson from News has been attending this week's Samsung Galaxy Unpacked launch. Now, Jen, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much.
Now, Samsung unpacked a fair amount, although, as we commented in a recent episode, there wasn't a lot that we didn't already suspect or indeed know a fair amount about.
Absolutely. It was, reasonably as we suspected. Even down to the name, although in America they call it Z instead of Z. But apart from that, this was basically a confirmation of most of what we knew about, with maybe a couple of tweaks here and there.
Yeah, so we're talking a bunch of new S20 phones. Technically sort of 3, although if you wanted to get pedantic, and I did, there's something like 19 different variants with colours and storage and stuff. And 5G especially, which actually we'll get to in a second, as well as the Z or Z Flip. I wonder if it'll be the Z Flip once it gets to Australia. But let's start in on the S20s. You've had some hands-on time, I'm guessing, with Samsung's new flagship S phones. What's impressed you so far?
Well, they've really focused on the camera this year. It's not that the rest of the phone is an afterthought, but certainly all of the really good stuff is happening in the camera. So with the top of the line Ultra, for example, there's 108 megapixels in that thing. And I've had a bit of a play with one. It wasn't fully ready to go, but it was quite impressive as it was. And you can take a photo with that thing and really zoom in down on detail and crop it and still have an excellent shot. And the sensor in it is 3 times as large as is typical of a phone camera, which is going to help both pack those pixels in, but also make for a better image at the end of it. And then they've got a zoom feature, which is interesting. At full range, it's a bit on the blurry side. Like you can basically make out what something says from very, very far away. If you're blind like me, maybe that's helpful. But it's not, pure picture taking excellence at 100 times, but it is an interesting feature to have and certainly outdoes some of their rivals.
Yeah, I was watching their live demo of it where they were shooting over the San Francisco Bay. And it was like, yeah, look, your 30 times zoom, that looks like a passable shot, maybe with a tripod. 100 times zoom may as well have been drawn in crayon.
Well, it's a bit of a Monet, as they say in Clueless. Yeah, it looks a big old mess up close.
Cameras, though, you said they focused in on them. They really needed to, I think. I think it's fair to say Samsung did good cameras last year when everyone else was doing great cameras, so they needed to punch back up there. Have you had much of an opportunity to play with it in low light? Because this is the other area where you really want a premium phone to punch forward.
Yeah, I did have a bit of a play with one. In low light, and using night mode is quite good. They were pretty decent at night mode before this. It does take a moment extra, but it does some excellent computation behind the scenes, and also having the larger sensor. So no matter which phone you get, either the Ultra or just a regular S20 or an S20 Plus, you do get a bigger sensor, which is always going to be better for low light shots. And I was quite impressed. I don't think it relied quite as much on the high ISO that we've seen in some other phone cameras. Although this whole idea about, you're going to ditch your SLR and just carry around your camera, maybe you will, but it won't be because, one completely replaces the photographic quality of the other.
I can't imagine you not carrying an SLR around. Like, you just wouldn't be you. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So maybe I'm coming from a very picky standpoint. However, these cameras really are quite great. And as you say, like they needed to do something big with their cameras. Samsung have had some really big camera additions in the past, and I think this is going to rank up there with them.
They're also doing 8K video recording. Is this just an effort to sell all of those 8K QLED TVs they've got?
Yes, it is, because you've got to get content for them somewhere. There's a lot of upscaling, obviously, that you can do with an 8K TV. They're saying that it's future-proofing, but honestly, like, you're going to fill up that storage in the phone really quickly. And I know that you can add an SD card to these. They come, up to 512 gigabytes of storage, but when you're taking photos that are that large and will take, 30 meg each, and then on top of that, you're adding 8K videos, you're going to fill up your hard drive and then your storage and then your cloud storage really quite quickly. So yes, it does do 8K. I don't know how many people will use it, but if you're, really into YouTube and you want to have the crispest face on YouTube, then certainly it's useful and it's there.
The other aspect, of course, that they're bringing to most of these phones, in fact, the vast majority of the ones they're launching in Australia, is 5G, although there's a weird inequality here if you buy the entry-level model, I should say, of the Galaxy S20, because its 5G is not quite like the 5G that you'll get on the Plus or the Ultra.
Yeah, it's interesting. And also with the Ultra, it's only available in 5G. So they figure if you're at the top end of the scale, then you really need all the Gs that come with those 5Gs. So it's interesting. And also, of course, with their folding phone, they've decided not to go 5G there, which they did with the other folding phone, which was, I assume, a battery limitation. So, yeah, there's a tiny bit of a mixed message there, although I think that Samsung are really playing up their whole role in the 5G rollout because they were the first out there with one of these phones, and they've certainly taken on a big share of the market, particularly because Apple isn't really playing yet.
Yeah, well, Apple kind of bet on Intel pretty heavily, and it came back to bite them. To be specific, though, the S20 is sub-6, 5G only. The higher-up models are sub-6 and millimetre wave, which is, again, that kind of future-proofing play, I guess. I mean, we're not really going to see a lot of millimetre wave 5G in Australia till at least mid to end of next year anyway.
Exactly. And I'm not sure that, people are necessarily paying attention to all the specs on that. So certainly it's something that, they'll get away with in the majority of the cases.
Okay, and you mentioned it before. It's the kind of elephant in the room. My particular favourite passion in mobile phones at the moment is folding phones, and they have the Z or Z Flip phone, which is launching in the States in like a day or two, but not in Australia.
No, so we're definitely second wave, and I think that we've seen a bit of this when it comes to folding phones. It's hard not to take it personally, certainly because Samsung has really treated Australia quite nicely up until now, but definitely when it comes to folding phones, it's one of those things where they can only make so many because they're very fancy and very finicky. This one in particular is an interesting one, though, I think. I mean, they've put glass on the screen that they're actually folding for the first time, which is interesting. They are going head-to-head with another company who actually has a model out in terms of the Motorola Razr. And it's a very different form to what we saw last time. It's no longer Penny's computer book from Inspector Gadget.
No, it's not. It's more a Star Trek communicator, if anything. I'm really curious about how foldable glass works, but I'm more curious about how it feels, because those plastic screens, certainly on the Galaxy Fold and even on Huawei's Mate X, they've got a certain kind of friction to them. They feel a little bit weird. Does the Z Flip feel any better in the hand when you're sliding a finger across it?
I think it does. I think where people might be a little bit thrown off is because the crease is still there where it actually folds over, and because it's right in the way of where you're sort of scrolling up and down the screen, that it might be a little bit more noticeable on this device than it was on the Galaxy Fold. But the screen is quite nice, and it's very, slippery under your fingers. It doesn't feel like anything, terribly different. Also with this folding phone, they've done something different with the outside screen, where it's basically a notification bar like you would find on, a phone from the 90s, like a flip phone. So you can see your notifications. You can, even if you want to, like, take a sly photo and see a little bit of the photo with that little panel, but it is a very small panel. So that's something different as well. And I think that's just all about sort of keeping this phone small, making sure that, the fashionable people they think are going to be buying it will be able to slip it into their pockets and tiny little wee Lizzo handbags.
I sort of like this idea that they had and they demoed on stage of it being almost like a tiny laptop that you fold open and have one part kind of sitting on a desk and one part sitting upwards and different apps running or different parts of an app running. Have you had a chance to give that a rundown?
A little bit, yeah. So I've had a look at the camera. The camera's interesting. Like I can see how it would be really useful to be able to prop it up like at a right angle on a desk so you can have a video chat that way, for example. However, I will say, like, when you take a photo like that, it actually, even though it takes the bottom of the photo and it doesn't change the format of the photo itself, that part disappears and that becomes like photo controls, which I found a little bit odd. I think it would be useful if you were taking a time lapse, a long exposure, for example, and you could, prop it up on a pylon or something, and you'd be able to, take a photo that way. So I think that would be useful. Although it is strange that you can't see the bottom half of that photo for that reason. But for other uses, I'm interested to see how people use this. Like, it was interesting to see they used the example of YouTube. And so you can see the video up top and the comments down below. Now, you would never want to read those comments, but at least you could reply to them, I suppose. I'm really fascinated by this idea of, yes, this is this new phone body, but now how do people actually want to use it like that?
Yeah, I can see myself in far too many cheap economy flight seats folding that thing up so I've got a little screen that I can use as opposed to kind of having to hold a phone if I've got video on there. I like the idea that Samsung's actually saying, hey, we're not just making foldable phones, we're making software that makes sense of a foldable phone, albeit with Google's help.
Absolutely. And I think that they've developed this technology over a period of time. I think this is proof that they're really looking for the best way to use it. And so this is going to appeal to different people than would appeal to the Fold. And so maybe they'll come up with a new way in future. Like back in the day, they were talking about, rolling your phone up. So even though batteries aren't quite there yet, potentially we could see a new form in the future as well. And I think it's really interesting. Like, at least Samsung is doing something completely different with phones. So it's not still the same sort of black mirror rectangular thing that, could be from any company, really.
I sort of want the purple model of that phone, actually, and that's not something I'd ever really considered I'd ever say about a phone, but it does look rather nice, although it's not all that cheap. Relative to the Galaxy Fold, it's the lower cost model, but it's not going to be cheap once it hits Australian shores, is it?
No. So if you do just a direct comparison between what it will be in the US and what it could be in Australia, it's still over $2,000. So with an Australia tax put on top of that, potentially you're looking at low twos, which is not a $3,000 phone, but is not cheap either.
And I think they've done an interesting job here. You mentioned the Motorola Razr before. They've done an interesting job slightly outdoing the Razr in some aspects. I mean, more camera, better processor, the flexible glass thing. But it's still not what you could get for your $2 and a bit grand. I mean, you could get the highest end model of the S20 Ultra for a start for that kind of money. Which way would you jump right now if you had to pick between the two?
I probably don't think that I'm actually in the sort of the market for this particular folding phone. Like the Galaxy Fold, I loved, and I would totally use that, even though it's $3,000 and it's basically my car. But the Ultra makes perfect sense to me because I'm interested in photography, and it's a beast. Like, it's not just a beast in terms of photography, but it actually has up to 16 gig of RAM. Like, that thing really powers on it and has 5G in it, which, I'm interested in, and has quite a large screen. I think the folding phone, the Z Flip, the Z Flip, is for a completely different audience. And yes, it's going to cost $2,000, but I think part of it will be about taking it out and flipping it up and showing everybody you've got it. I think that it feels a lot more solid than the Motorola, and certainly with, the glossy, potentially purple finish, which apparently they call gender neutral here, which I found interesting. Then I think that it could potentially stand out. And the fact that they're taking it to New York Fashion Week says that as well.
I must admit, I did not like the look of what you could see of that Fashion Week version of that model, but maybe that's just me, and I don't think I'm in the market for that particular foldable either. Finally, of course, they also, and this was not a secret either, they also introduced new Galaxy Buds. Now, you don't exactly go hands-on with those, but have you gone ears-on with them?
I have gone ears on with them, and so far they're pretty good. They're not wildly different, I've got to say. They don't introduce the active noise cancellation that we saw inside Apple's competitors, the Pros, the AirPod Pros. However, I'm pretty impressed. They seem a little bit more comfortable, and they also do a better job. They've got extra microphones of doing ambient sound, which was a complaint that I had with some of the earlier ones, that you would put these in and you kind of felt like your ears were not quite popping on the plane yet, and so you couldn't really hear the outside world. I ended up just putting like one ear in and leaving one ear out for most of the time. So they do a better job of ambient sound, which could be useful if you're going to put these things in and then go running or biking or something outdoors where you actually need to be able to hear the traffic and people yelling at you to stop.
I was pretty impressed with their claim of, I think it's 11 hours of battery life, which is quite a lot to get out of a small bud. I know you're someone who spends pretty much your entire life on planes. I'm guessing you'll be giving those the really thorough in-flight treatment soon?
Yes, absolutely. And I also quite like the old models too, these ones can be charged on the back of your phone wirelessly as well. And I mean, it might sound a bit of a gimmick, but it's actually quite useful in a crisis when you absolutely positively need to listen to YouTube clips and don't want to subject the rest of the world to them.
Yeah, well, look, a bit of advice for the listeners. Don't subject anyone to your YouTube clips, no matter how wonderful you think your taste may be, because you may just find that I'm behind you and I will test just how waterproof your phone is by throwing it into a nearby river. Thanks so much for your time, Jen. Now, if folks want to catch up with your writing work, where's the best place for them to do that?
All the News Corp titles and, Daily Telegraph, Courier Mail, Herald Sun, I'm all over the place.
And if they want to find you on social media, they will find you at...
Jen Dudley, that's me.
Too easy. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, that just about wraps up yet another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks again to Supratim and Jen for making the time for the show this week. Got some feedback for them or for us? Catch up with us on Twitter at VerticalHoldAU or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
And as always, thanks everyone for tuning in once again. We really appreciate your shout outs, your feedbacks, reviews. Keep them coming. Vertical Hold is proudly sponsored by Casa Systems, taking Australian technology to the global market.